All right, it's 7:01. We are going to begin, even though people continue to enter our Zoom room. Once again, it's really great to see you. We have an extraordinary community filled with passionate, curious, thoughtful individuals. And so I am continually amazed by the participation of our community in Torah, in Avodah, spiritual search, and in Gemilut Chasadim, of just caring for our world and deeds of loving kindness. I have never seen our community as active as it is right now. I want to begin by introducing one of our co-chairs of our Racial Justice Initiative. They have worked very hard with an extraordinarily large group of individuals and committee, along with Rabbi Sherman, doing some really extraordinary work, not just during the pandemic, but prior to that, for several years now. Really incredible, and we should be very proud of the work that they've accomplished. So Ediss, will you take it away?
Yes. Good evening. On behalf of the Racial Justice Initiative, I want to thank Rabbi Sisselwine and Sherman for facilitating what promises to be an informative evening about the Black Lives Matter movement. As we heard at the close of the September 14th RJI meeting, emotions run deep when the phrase Black Lives Matter is used, and we're hopeful that tonight's presentation will help us more fully understand what BLM is and isn't, and how TBE congregants can express our solidarity with the Black community. Is our support of BLM an expression of a social value, the rallying cry of this generation, much as Save Soviet Jewelry was to my generation, or is it a political anti-Israel BDS statement? We hope that tonight's presentation will help us craft a path forward for the TBE congregants' expression. Before we get to our speakers, let me mention two upcoming RJI events. First is our holiday gift collection for the William Monroe Trotter School in Dorchester's Grove Hall neighborhood. I don't need to tell you that there's a pandemic within the pandemic, especially for Grove Hall families. Unemployment, escalating violence, and COVID are the trifecta of a grim holiday season. Almost 1/3 of Trotter families are homeless or housing insecure, many facing eviction. Information on how you can participate is posted in the chat box, I hope, Philip, and may be found on the TBE portal, or please contact me. Second, on December 7th, the quarterly RJI meeting hot topic is what the racial wealth gap looks like today and what we can do about it. Our own Alan Solomont will moderate a distinguished panel that includes Dr. Carolyn Crockett, the City of Boston's new Chief of Equity, Quincy Miller, CEO of Eastern Bank and one of the 19 founding members of the new Commonwealth Fund for Racial Equity and Social Justice, and Segun Aduwu, Executive Director of the Black Economic Council of Massachusetts. And that just covers now through December. So please also look for information on January's MLK commemorative activities and a community book read on Pulitzer Prize winner Isabel Wilkerson's new book, Cast. On behalf of my RJI co-chair, Sherry Kassira, let us close by thanking you all for joining us tonight to learn together about Black Lives Matter and deepen our collective understanding of how TBE can express its allyship with people of color. We also thank the hundreds of volunteers who participated in the Every Voice, Every Vote initiative and all of our other RJI sponsored events. Stay tuned. Joel?
Thank you, Ediss. Once again, it's good to see everyone on this call. I'm really glad you're with us for this important hour of learning. You have been muted so that we can avoid some of the embarrassing comments that have leaked out on Zoom over the past 6 months, when people ask questions and then forget to mute themselves once again. But we will have a question period. And so we invite you to use the chat room this time instead. And Rabbi Sherman, will they see my name? Is that how it works?
As far as I know, the only person that they can chat with is you.
Perfect. You'll send me your
Can
questions.
Can somebody
And
give me a thumbs up? Great.
Great. And then I will do my best to offer them all to our speaker this evening. So with that, I want to welcome Jeremy Burton. I am deeply grateful for his leadership in our community, his menschlichkeit, his kindness, and his flexibility, because we had to reschedule this talk due to a scheduling snafu. But I am deeply grateful that Jeremy is here with us this evening. Many of you know him, for many of our members work closely with the JCRC, and Jeremy is its executive director. Jeremy came to the Jewish community from a career in political strategy and public communications, having worked for New York Mayor David Dinkins, Manhattan Borough President Ruth Messinger, and 1996, the Clinton-Gore re-election campaign. Previously, he was the Senior Vice President of Programs in the Jewish Funds for Justice and Vice President of Programs at the Jewish Funders Network. Jeremy also served as a board member of Keshet, working for the full inclusion of LGBTQ Jews in Jewish life. Jeremy is an incredible leader in our community, for whom we should all be grateful. And so, Jeremy, once again, thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Rabbi, and thank you, everybody. It's very kind of you to, both in your introduction and to welcome me into your community as you are having an important conversation. It's wonderful to see many friends in the Zoom boxes, and I know that there are many, many pages in front of me, so I don't see everybody, but miss many of you very dearly in these last several months, and it's great to see you in these spaces, and hopefully the next time we have a conversation like this, we can do it together in physical proximity with each other. I read the promo for this, and I've talked to Rabbi Sisson-Wine, and I very much appreciate the committee leaders, Ediss and Sherry, for bringing this together and framing this. And I'm not going to give you a simple answer. Like, we are not going to, in the next 45 minutes, answer the question definitively of the relationship between Black Lives Matter and the Jewish community. If anything, I hope that at the end of our talk, you will go away with even more complexity and nuance about what the relationship is, and frankly, how Jewish institutions and the Jewish community and some of our partners in the Black community are thinking about this. Now, I will just say, for those of you who are not familiar with the Jewish Community Relations Council, just to sort of introduce a little bit of how I am coming to this and how we come to this. We are a membership network of 40 other Jewish organizations in Greater Boston. And it's an incredible diversity of organizations. It runs the gamut from J Street to APAC to 3 Hadassah chapters to the ZOA regional chapter. We have American Jewish Committee and ADL. We have JCCs and cultural institutions, and we have deeply political active institutions like Jewish Alliance for Law and Social Action, New Israel Fund. So you get really just very different parts of our community. And our fundamental work is about bringing the complexity and diversity of the organized Jewish community in Boston together to figure out what are our values and interests in the broader civic space and how we go about achieving those. And some of those are self-interest. We have interest as a Jewish community, for example, engaging civic leaders, our local elected officials, our interfaith partners with Israel, as we understand it. And Rabbi Sisson-Wine, I so look forward to the day we can start having trips again, because the last one that got canceled this summer was one that Rabbi Sisson-Wine was going to co-lead. But it's also about how we act upon our values with others about our idea about the United States, about our vision and our hopes, about a nation that is democratic, pluralistic, and I'm going to underscore the word just in our mission. That we, as an organized Jewish community in Boston, see our work as achieving a just United States and doing that in partnership with others. And I'm putting that forward to you all to know that this is not a simple conversation for us. What is Black Lives Matter? Who is Black Lives Matter? What do we mean when we say Black Lives Matter? And part of that complexity is just to paint a broader picture. This is not a simple, like, there is an organization, there is a structure and a hierarchy. If I was to tweet, quote unquote, Jewish federations believe, everybody essentially would know we're either talking about the National Jewish Federations or the network of local Jewish federations like CJP that make significant, massive contributions to the endeavors of a national system of federations. If I was to say the Reform movement believes, not everybody here believes the same, Reform movement is a diverse group, but you know who we're talking about, and you know what the process is by which the Reform movement, quote unquote, believes something. Black Lives Matter, this movement, organizations, plural, system, idea, vision, all of those things can be said about it, is a 21st century model of social movement. There is no central hierarchy. It is not top down. So let's back up just a little tiny bit and say, essentially, the simplest version of this is that Black Lives Matter begins in the wake of the murder of Trayvon Martin. And that was in 2013. And then George Zimmerman was acquitted of that murder. And there was real rage that so many of us, I'm going to assume here, I know rage that I personally felt and was expressing, that George Zimmerman walked away acquitted. And at that time, two activists, these were not like the CEO of a national organization. This was not the head of some major institution that had built up credibility and followers and a constituency. These were two activists online, Alicia Garza and Patrice Cullors, who in that moment of rage tweeted, and I don't mean rage, I'm not being negative about rage. Rage is a powerful emotion for change. Essentially, rage tweeted the hashtag Black Lives Matter. And that's when a movement took off. Others began to use that hashtag. Others used that hashtag after them. And lo and behold, it became the term to understand something, to frame a concept that there was something deeply broken in our criminal justice system as Americans, for which, for many, I'm not gonna say every person in the Black community, but for many Black Americans who were expressing the experience of it was not clear to them, it was not their experience that Black lives mattered in our criminal justice system. Having said that, a lot will happen. I'm giving you a very shorthand version of this, particularly after Ferguson. Many different organizations began to crop up around the country. It is a disorganized network. This is not, there is not a formal national convening of every organization that uses the word Black Lives Matter. Not even all these organizations that use the term Black Lives Matter in their name are even registered as C3s or C4s or anything. It is a very diffuse set of organizations that use the term Black Lives Matter. And a lot of other organizations that are long existing. Let's say the NAACP, the Urban League, and others, leaders who had constituencies, leaders who were institutions are using this term. Some of those groups that are called Black Lives Matter X, like let's say Black Lives Matter Cambridge, Black Lives Matter Boston, Black Lives Matter Seattle, some of those groups engage with the system as it is. For example, in Baltimore, a local Black Lives Matter leader who ran for mayor. In other places, they very much do not. Some of these groups use civil disobedience. Some of you will remember 4 years ago here in Boston, there were several shutdowns of some of our highways. Groups that put drums in the middle of the Northeast Expressway. Different tactics, different groups, different movement. What is important to know and to understand, and this is where it gets hard because so many of us are like, well, of course Black Lives Matter, and of course we have to show up. Of course we have to express that. Of course we have to be there, and we should be with any leaders who are working to do this work. The complexity shows up on a couple of levels. And we really start to see this in the 2015, 2016 period. One of which is, and I'm going to say this is not about Black Lives Matter, but the Palestinian solidarity movement in this country, and I should actually be more particular, say certain parts of the Palestine solidarity movement, their strategic approach is to glom on to other social movements. So you will see, we've had this experience here in Boston in recent years, for example, of Palestinian solidarity organizations I'm using their terminology, Palestine solidarity groups. I can use other terms if I'm being me. Who sees the climate change agenda and start talking about the liberation of Palestine being connected to climate change. That happens. In the context of Black Lives Matter, we certainly saw after Ferguson and in 2015, 2016, Palestinian solidarity groups showing up in those spaces, and you start to see the language of from Palestine to Ferguson. And you start to see particular left-wing groups who support the boycott and the delegitimization of Israel, inviting these emerging leaders within the Black Lives Movement to go to, in particular, Palestinian areas on the West Bank, and to learn, experience, see the connectivity between the Black Lives Matter movement and the Palestinian liberation movement. And again, we can spend hours talking about that, but I'm saying that's what happened. And some key leaders, including Patrisse Cullors, one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter. What does co-founder mean? She co-branded a hashtag, endorses boycott, divestment, sanctions, endorses terminology of apartheid in relationship to Israel. In this moment, 2016, there are efforts to get this disparate, disorganized, diffuse social movement organized. And the most notable one of those was the Movement for Black Lives. And again, the terminology site, there's the Movement for Black Lives Matter, an organization Patrisse Cullors sets up, Black Lives Matter, a hashtag and a social movement. The Movement for Black Lives, I will be honest with you, the vast majority of people who are in the streets and many, many people that we work with in the African-American movement and the civil rights movement, they have nothing to do with it. They don't know what it is. And I will say, frankly, in a Jewish audience, because we can talk amongst ourselves a little bit, there are divides within the African-American community that are very similar to divides within the Jewish community, generational, hierarchical, young people who don't believe in the institutions or the system, who just, who are like, I don't need a synagogue. I can make an independent, spiritual, holy, sacred place in my living room with my 5 friends. Or I don't need federation. I'm doing my own thing. Those dynamics of generation, those dynamics of anti-institutionalism, we are not the only community that has those experiences. And so some of the classic civil rights movement organizations that we know and work with as a community are not at this table of the Movement for Black Lives. And there was real work being done by groups like, we'll call it Students for Justice in Palestine or Jewish Voice for Peace, to influence that space and to engage some of those people in their perspective of that from Palestine to Ferguson. And the result was a series of things. One, the organization Black Lives Matter, and it's not even the only organization that calls itself Black Lives Matter, but the organization Black Lives Matter, led by Patrisse Cullors, has a leader who explicitly endorses language, political understandings, and policy around Israel that we as a mainstream organized Jewish community find offensive. Her. 2, Movement for Black Lives issues a platform in 2016 that uses the word apartheid in regards to Israel, and has a policy agenda that goes way, it was a systemic change global platform, which is to say it went well beyond criminal justice reform or racial justice reform or racial equity in the United States, and including it calling for the end of American military aid to Israel. So use the word apartheid. They also use the word genocide with regard to the Israeli-Palestinian relationship and the military aid thing. And that was a blow-up moment for a lot of us in the Jewish community, including us at JCRC. We had been in a space of trying to find a way to engage and embrace the justice cause of Black Lives Matter in the summer of 2016. And very much like so many other Jewish organizations said, like, well, if this is it, if this is the movement for Black Lives, that's a non-functional relationship for us. It's not something we can work with. Others tried to find more nuance. There was a lot of noise in 2016. it mostly died down until this year. You know, the realities are, whether you voted for Donald Trump or you voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016, after 2016, the political conversation in this country until this summer really, like, Black Lives Matter didn't cease to be a topic of great importance to many in the African-American community, but it ceased to be a driving thing around which organizing was done centrally. But it never quite went away. It was there until this year. So where we're at in 2020, in the summer 2020, we still have the movement for Black Lives. That platform, some people will tell you that platform has been taken down. I will tell you it has not been taken down. It has been reframed. But it is, if you actually, it's interesting. They took it, they be technology about it. They converted it into a PDF and put it as an attachment at the bottom of a page on the website, so it doesn't easily be found by search. You know, if you're Google searching for it, you can't find the words easily, apartheid, genocide, but it's still there. And by the way, it's our understanding and the other understanding of other Jewish organizations that are working in the space of Black Lives Matter right now, that the movement for Black Lives is working on another platform right now, which will be, let's just say, we're informed it will be equally problematic. So we are under no illusions that this organization, the movement for Black Lives, is suddenly more palatable for some parts of the Jewish community than it was 4 years ago. Black Lives Matter, the organization, still has this leader. Interesting question about what her attachment to it is. But those aren't the only parts of this, because, and this is where I'm going to end up my opening part of this conversation with, because I really want to get into your questions. Tonight's talk, the way it was framed, was the Jewish community's relationship to Black Lives Matter. And it's not the Jewish community's relationship to Black Lives Matter, it's the Jewish community's relationship to our African-American partners. And for the moment, I'm not even talking about like Latino partners or other communities of color. I'm talking specifically about the African-American community. And I will be particular in the sense of, I'm talking about the external. There is a Jewish African-American community. When we're talking about the African-American community, we're also talking about members of our own community who experience something about racism in America. But I'm not actually talking about that right now. But I always feel I have to name that, because it is, frankly, I have learned and heard it many times that it's offensive to African-American Jews when we say it's an us and them relationship. But in the context of this question of what is the Jewish community's relationship to Black Lives Matter, I'm just going to say from now, us and them, in the sense of like, is relationship to the African-American community. It's a relationship to African-American leaders. It's a relationship to African-American movements. It's a relationship to African-American institutions. Not all of those organizations, leaders, and institutions have the brand name hashtag Black Lives Matter in the title of their organization. The NAACP Boston does not have that, you know, like, that's not their name. They're not Black Lives Matter Boston, they're NAACP Boston. You know, you were talking about the upcoming program with Alan Solomon. You know, these are leaders as well. BECMA, the Black Economic Council of Massachusetts, is another organization. They don't use the term Black Lives Matter in their name, but they are a key African-American institution that is emerging over the last 10 years in our community. And they are a valuable partner to institutions and communities and congregations of the Jewish community. So when, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd in May, Black Lives Matter moved back onto the front page, Black Lives Matter as a concept moved back into the front of our minds as a specific, concrete social movement, an urgent social movement of our time, the conversation in Jewish communities is not just about what is our relationship to the movement for Black lives, what is our relationship to the organization that has a problematic leader. It's what is our relationship and our responsibility to our partners, who we actually deal with and know and stand in solidarity with. And that's the context in which, for example, an ADL New England, and I'm going to use a couple examples, but it's not to the exclusion of others, the ADL New England, which is in deep partnership with NAACP Boston. In fact, this summer, the NAACP National Convention was supposed to be in Boston. Last year, the leadership of ADL New England was part of a delegation along with Mayor Walsh and that flew to the NAACP conference, I think it was in Detroit, to actually like have that sort of like, you know, US Olympic, you know, the Olympics where they pass the flag from one city to the next. But like our ADL regional leadership was part of the NAACP host committee for a conference that was canceled this summer here in Boston. That would have been visible. And that would have been a month after, it would have been about a month, 6 weeks after George Floyd was murdered. Jewish Alliance for Law and Social Action, one of our member organizations, works very closely with BECMA. Deep partnership. They're doing serious work around purchasing power. They're trying to engage synagogues in the role that synagogues and temples use our purchasing power to build up and support Black and other minority-owned businesses. We, JCRC, I mentioned that Rabbi Sisson-Wine was going to lead a delegation to Israel. These delegations are groups of clergy, Black, white, Christian, Jewish, Catholic, Protestant, ILE delegations with civic leaders. Some of those people, Andrea Campbell, who was then the Boston City Council president, now running for mayor of Boston, she led a delegation to Israel for us 2 years ago for JCRC, of other city councilors and municipal leaders from around the Commonwealth. Those leaders, it's those relationships, not just an organization called Black Lives Matter, but it's those leaders and organizations that are also part of this. What is our relationship to Black Lives Matter? And it's those leaders who are approaching us and saying, we need you. We want to know where our Jewish friends are. We want to know where our Jewish friends are in partnership with us. And it's what, it's that kind of conversation. And I think, frankly, for many institutions, I think, for ADL, they organized a statement from many Jewish institutions across New England at the end of June to explicitly say that we have work to do as a Jewish community on this, and to explicitly say that we are committed to the concept and the necessity of saying that Black Lives Matter, and that hasn't been the experience for all Americans. For us at JCRC, frankly, we were very explicit that our endorsement of a racial justice agenda on Beacon Hill, which, by the way, has, in the odd dynamics of Massachusetts politics, more of it has been endorsed by Governor Baker than has been actually passed by the Democratic legislature. And it's now 6 months later. That's nothing has actually been passed and signed, but it is interesting that the governor was faster to, here's a racial justice agenda that I'm doing with the Black and Latino caucus. And we're being responsive to the Black and Latino caucus. We're being responsive to our partners in Black clergy who are like, we need you out there endorsing this agenda. We need you out there saying that Black Lives Matter. And it's one of those things where language matters. And so we find ourselves, Jewish institutions, saying, who are we accountable to? Who are our partners? And what is the language they need us to honor to be good partners? And that's the complexity we're in right now. And we're in a serious conversation. It comes up, I think, I know there's 1 or 2 people here from our council. It comes up in almost every council meeting that we have when all of our 40 member organizations at the table. There's, what do we do about? How do we understand anti-Semitism within the Black Lives Matter movement? How do we understand some of these concerns? We have some members who have issued white papers saying that the Black Lives Matter movement or the Black Lives Matter organization are anti-Semitic. They aren't entirely wrong. But the question is, do you go narrow and specific and look at one institution or one leader or several leaders? Or do you go broadly and say, this is a cause that is overwhelmingly important to a large part of the American population and a lot of people we are in relationship with, a lot of people who we value. And more importantly, is it, to our understanding of the constant liberal ideal of the improving of America? And therefore, how do we challenge ourselves to sit in that nuance and complexity to say Black Lives Matter, but we also care about anti-Semitism where we see it? I will pause there for now. I've said a lot.
Thank you so much. The questions are coming in, and the first 2 are actually related. So I'm going to ask them together, although I think they're both significant, which is to say, can someone ever say Black Lives Matter without implying the movements? And the converse is, when 600 Jewish organizations signed the Black Lives Matter statement, what were they agreeing to?
So I hope it's clear that I think someone can say Black Lives Matter without endorsing, quote unquote, the movement for Black Lives or the organization that's called Black Lives Matter. Many do. Many Jewish institutions, many leaders, many Americans say, look, there was a moment this summer where the term Black Lives Matter in polling, if you said, do you support the movement Black Lives Matter? 70% of Americans said yes. I would guarantee that the overwhelming majority of those have no idea what the organization and the URL is to find the movement for Black Lives. Those are just different things. And so the challenge is, it's like every other term, lehavdil, I hate to use this illusion, but in the fall of 2016, the first time we really started hearing fake news was mainstream media talking about disinformation that was done by Russian activists in the 2016 election. Within 4 weeks, a certain incoming president was using that term to mean entirely something else. And we no longer use the term fake news the way it first appeared in the media 4 years ago. Terms, and I think one of the challenges and like why it's important to have these conversations to be really clear is to say, what do we mean when we use a term? What do we mean at JCRC when we talk about the occupation, for example? What do we mean? Because different people use different words and different people have different meaning. So I think it's important to say, from our perspective, Black Lives Matter, but to understand we're talking about the concept, the idea, the movement, and honoring the agenda of our partners in the African-American community, not to say Black Lives Matter, we're endorsing a particular organization. The 600 organizations, I don't know who asked the question. I know what you're talking about, and I feel like I need to do a little more unpacking because I'm guessing that a lot of people don't know. But so there was a statement.
So that the questions are not meant to be anonymous. That's from Ed Gaskin.
Okay, so let me say something. Thank you. Hi, Ed. I was wondering, I knew you had questions that were specific and I was wondering what they were. So around the end of June, mid-July, somewhere in that window, I'm going to say there was a deliberate effort, and this is like complicated and messy and something that's actually a little painful for a lot of us in the Jewish community who care deeply about racial justice. But there was a conscious effort, including some within the Jewish community, to essentially delegitimize Black Lives Matter as a cause at a time that it was gaining a lot of elevated attention in American life. And there were definitely some Jewish institutions involved in that. There was a conscious effort to say it's all about these leaders that I've talked about, or it's all about that one organization. And therefore to deny any Jewish responsibility to engage with racial justice as a cause. And in that moment, I'm going to say, and I actually don't know who made this request, but apparently certain leaders, activists within the Black Lives Matter work made the request of their Jewish partners, and particularly of Ben the Ark. And by the way, Joel, Rabbi Sisson-Wine introduced me and said I was the former senior vice president of Jewish Funds for Justice. 3 months after I left Jewish Funds for Justice, they rebranded as Ben the Ark. So this is an organization I know. I have many, many years of history in their senior leadership. They received a request from their partners in the African-American community, and they very much sit on the ideological and activist left. I mean, they're not a centrist organization. To organize a Jewish statement in solidarity that whoever these people were, felt they were under attack from within the Jewish community, and that they were looking for Jewish leaders to, in fact, validate the cause of Black Lives Matter, and to validate that we ought not denigrate the activists of Black Lives Matter at this time. For a variety of reasons, and it was a very complex sort of like, I'm going to say herd mentality at times, where we all do it. We look to who else is doing something, who else is signing on. For us at JCRC, we have 40 member organizations, so we're mindful of like, and by the way, this is true on many, many different issues. We often ask ourselves, where's the ADL national on this? Where's the URJ national on this? Where's AJC national on this? That's the kind of conversations we have so there was a bit of a herd mentality. 600 organizations signed on to a statement that had been organized by Ben the Ark. I should say explicitly, and I have the emails to prove it, that Ben the Ark told these 600 organizations that it was a one-time statement that was only going to be used for the single purpose of a message of solidarity in early July and for no other purpose. And so we signed on to it. And got a little bit of attention, not a lot, but a little bit of attention. And clearly whoever their allies where they needed to show it to saw it. Jump forward about 6 weeks, mid-late August, and everybody gets an email from Ben the Ark saying, on the date of the March on Washington anniversary, when there was going to be the new March on Washington, we are going to run this ad in the New York Times with the names of all 600 signatories. Do you want to remove your name before it runs in the Times? And let's just say many of us were like, well, we weren't necessarily trying to be seen as endorsing that specific march. We're feeling a little used in that we signed it for one purpose and now it's being used for another purpose. But at the same time, we know that if we take our name off a statement we already signed on to, someone's going to come after us for standing for something in early July and not in end of August. And so that's how that's how a lot of institutions, including JCRC Boston, ending up on an ad in the New York Times at the end of August that didn't land in all parts of our Jewish community particularly well.
Thank you. Thank you. Another question. I'm going to read it how it was written, although I think it needs to be amended. It was written, do Black Lives Matter condemn conduct in other countries like China? Is there a double standard applied to Israel? A core belief of Judaism is we're created in the image of God. Why can't we use all lives matter? Now, I think I said that maybe it needs to be refocused because of the nuance of Black Lives Matter. But I throw that to you. How do you respond to that complexity of term?
I mean, I think it's a question that I hope in part I've already started to address, which is separating, let's take the question and say, does the movement for Black Lives, that particular organization, that particular network with that particular platform, condemn human rights violations, genocide that is going on in a wide variety of places around the world? I'm going to say to the best of my knowledge, no, although I think I'm not 100% right in that. I would say, I think probably the more accurate answer, and again, I have not read their platform in several years that closely, not with the same language, not with the same, emphasis. It would be interesting to see if they actually are doing a new platform, whether that's one of the things that they've incorporated from the feedback and criticism they got in 2016, but definitely not. That is a general comment we can make about a lot of forces on the left who seek to delegitimize Israel. And that is, by the way, when we talk about how do we define anti-Semitism, and most Jewish communal institutions rely on the International Holocaust Restitution Association definition of anti-Semitism, which is also the definition of anti-Semitism that was embraced and adopted by the State Department under President Obama and Secretary Kerry. And people tend to say, oh, it's no good because the President Trump and his agencies use it. It's like, no, they just adopted what President Obama was using. But within that definition, examples of anti-Semitism, there's a definition about anti-Semitism, but there are also examples. And one of those examples is a double standard with regard to Israel. Is Israel held accountable, accused in language or form in ways that are different from other institutions, other nations and other states? Or is it criticized in a normal way that states are criticized? I can criticize, I'm not going to criticize it. It is normal to criticize a country's, tariff policies. It is not normal to say a country has no right to exist because of certain things. And it is certainly not fair, balanced to criticize Israel for something and then not criticize other countries for the same thing. And I think it's fair to say that certainly in parts of the left, and certainly amongst the parts of, say, Movement for Black Lives or the organization Black Lives Matter, those leaders that you often hear about in certain Jewish spaces, their criticism of Israel is unique and specific to Israel and is not representative of a consistent human rights analysis that they then apply to other countries.
Thanks. So normally I reframe the questions and simplify them for the ear, but I'm going to read this one verbatim as well, because in this case, the terminology is such a large part of the story. So this is the way it's written. How do we as a temple community come together around Black Lives Matter when we are in this complexity where so many don't support the movement?
I'll give a three-part answer. Part one is do the internal work of deciding what you understand as the racial justice gap in this country, what's lacking, what you understand is missing, what you understand is necessary to repair. Do that work internally. Don't use the term Black Lives Matter. Talk about racial justice. Talk about racial equity. Talk about inequality, even if you want systemic racism, but have that conversation about how you understand that, and have that conversation including bringing in, inviting in, who are the partners, who are we learning from, who do we want to be in relationship to here locally. Think locally, very Tip O'Neill. I know that's not popular anymore, but think locally. Then second, from that, how do we understand it as one community? Also, and it's a sort of overlap, and who are we accountable to in that work, and what do they need from us? We are accountable to certain Black churches in our neighborhood, however you define that as a particular congregation, or is it accountable to members of our own holy community who are Black, or is it we're accountable to certain clergy that we're in partnership with? Is it we're accountable to certain civic leaders? Define the accountability space, and then say, and I guarantee you, knowing what I do about Temple Beth Elohim, that if you've done those two things, you will come to the conclusion that addressing racial justice at Temple Beth Elohim requires some use of the term Black Lives Matter. And it will be like, and this is how we understand it. And I think you have to communicate, this is how we understand it, and this is how we use it, and this is the action it calls us to. We don't do statements about Black Lives Matter every 2 minutes. We did one statement about Black Lives Matter that used the terminology with ADL in June. We did a statement on behalf of the organized community right after George Floyd was murdered. It's not about the statements, it's about the work. And we to the extent that we use the terminology right now, it's often in the context of moving this racial justice agenda on Beacon Hill, which is not moving. So we're not using it for other people's agenda. We're not using it for other people's terminology. We're using it to advance our work, whatever we've come to understand as our work. And I was just encouraged that approach. How do we understand this moment? Who are we accountable to? And then explaining how we use this language in service to our own actions as a community.
Thank you. Another question. Black Lives Matter student organization at a local college sought out signatures of support for a platform that included BDS. The group took the position that you were a racist if you wouldn't sign. How should a Jewish student respond?
I don't know which specific campus / institution we're talking about. I think it's very important to not allow anyone, let me back up. I think there's a larger problem of people defining other people in very and I think there's a problem in sort of like the framework of racist and anti-racist, that it's a binary thing. And it's going on, frankly, here in Boston. I think there's Ibram Kendi at BU. I think some of his writing and teaching is interesting, and some of it is challenging, and some of it is problematic, and sometimes all three. But that, when we create binaries with us or against us in any situation, good and bad, no in between, no we're on a spectrum, no right to the I'm here but I'm not yet here. And that's not to say I'm going to yet be here, like to use your example, BDS. It's very destructive for our society. Like a lot of our problems are very much of this fractured, polarized nature of with us or against us dynamic. So in that question, I would say, first of all, there's a work of rejecting the premise as a larger ethos in our society. And then there's the secondary thing of we, and if that comes specifically the student in that case, I would say our work is to be authentic to who we are and our values, and to be authentic to what we believe in the civic spaces we're in. And not to let other people define us in a way that is dangerous or toxic. And that means we have to step into that space fully ourselves and show up and say, I am anti-BDS. Here's why. I see that as anti-Semitic. I see that as anti-peace. And by the way, those are two different problems with the BDS movement. And I am opposed to it. And none of that takes away from my commitment to racial justice and the work of doing the work of doing systemic repair in the United States. And we have to be authentic to both. So it essentially means I'm not going to sign your petition, but I'm going to do something else instead. And I think we have to be a little forceful about that. We have to say, like, no, I'm not going to do that, and no, you don't get to say that. Therefore, I am a racist.
Another question: can we use the terminology Black Lives Matter as we did the civil rights movement, knowing that the civil rights movement had a wide range of groups, including the Communist Party, but they all supported civil rights for Blacks. And now we're saying we all support Black Lives Matter.
I think part of the problem is, like, and this is like the simplistic terminology of like a Twitter-driven economy of public thinking right now. What does it mean when we support Black Lives Matter? If we actually distance that phrase that was just used from this conversation, we support Black Lives Matter, it's not even a proper sentence, right? We support the civil rights movement, whether we do or we don't. There's a sentence there. We support Black Lives Matter is, again, we're falling into the we support Black Lives Matter as if, well, again, it's the organization, it's the hashtag. So I think we have to be clear. We support the work that has to be done so that our African-American neighbors, our African-American brothers and sisters, the African-American members of our community experience an America in which Black Lives Matter in a way that they do not experience that right now. Like, we have to fill in the sentence in order to actually say what we're saying here.
My guess in response to that question is that those who felt deeply existentially threatened by the Communist Party didn't use the word civil rights movement out of discomfort. And I wonder if it's because parts of the Jewish community feel the existential threat presented by the anti-Zionism that exists within the Black Lives Matter fold that gives us as Jews a unique discomfort that might not exist in other parts of society.
I mean, I certainly feel that discomfort myself, and have sat in a lot of uncomfortable situations with Black partners, Black colleagues. Have another one coming tomorrow that I'm not looking forward to. That's another story. You know, if we're going to use the example of communism and the civil rights movement, you know, there was a real effort to deny the legitimacy of the civil rights movement. And, you know, there was a real effort to say they're communists. And there were serious people in this country, serious public officials who were like, it's a communist agenda. And this, of course, being in the 1950s and 60s when communism was kind of like, you know, was an actual thing, at least on the global stage. And I mean, we could, you know, the leaders within the civil rights movement who had actual institutional credibility. The Southern Christian Leaders Conference, these were actual pastors of actual churches with actual constituencies and actual bases. They grappled with, do we distance? Do we embrace? What do we do with this? We can't allow a movement to be marginalized and shut down. And I'm not, I'm not criticizing anybody, but there are some interesting, important, and frankly, notes to that moment that would not get repeated today. Certain leaders within the civil rights movement who were gay, for example, who were sort of kept off the podium at various places. There were certain leaders, there were people who were like valued for their strategic thinking, but had a history in Marxism, and other leaders in the movement pushed them aside. And yet still other people in our society, and you go watch the videos of Southern, go watch videos from the 1960s of Southern governors talking about these Marxists and communists. I mean, or of the FBI for that matter. It's very easy. And I think this is challenging work. It's hard work, and we have to have hard conversations. It's very easy in so many ways, in so many places, to find the most extreme, toxic, dangerous element of a movement and use it as an excuse to do nothing. Doing nothing is easy. Doing nothing is, I've seen that, I am no longer obligated to this idea, this cause, this person, and I'm done. The harder work is saying, I have a problem here. There's a piece of this that threatens me, and I still have moral obligations. And I'm not saying that to say this is what TVE should do or must do. I'm just saying, like, that's the conversation that's harder. And there are people who prefer that not happening. And the result of that, coming back to the other thing, is like we get into our bifurcated, toxic, fractured society because I have an excuse not to be with you, and you have, I'm an Orthodox Jew by background. Some people don't think I'm Orthodox anymore, but whatever. There are so many ways that the Orthodox and the Reform can find ways to say, I can't be with you. You're not a Jew. You're not a Jew. You're not legitimate. You're not legitimate. We do that. It is a normal part of it is not a healthy part, but it is a normal part of human behavior. And I just think the question is not as what, and I have it, the existential sense that there are real threats on the fringe left to the future of the Jewish people. I think there are real threats to the American creed and the American liberal idea on the left, and we have to be aware of them. And we have to be honest about them existing. But I think, I'm getting a little on my soapbox here, if there is a threat from the left to the American liberal idea in so many ways, and by the way, I do believe that Zionism and support for a Jewish state in our homeland is part of the American liberal idea. But if there's a threat from the left, one answer is, it's all toxic, walk away, and we should all be, just in a different polar camp. And the other answer is, you don't get to define, you're not committed to liberalism. You on the American left who are challenging that, you're not committed to the American idea and American liberalism. You're trying to dismantle it to create something new. And we're gonna fight for American liberalism, and we're gonna fight for the American idea. And part of fighting for it means believing in part of that idea is the continuous improvement, the continuous evolution, the continuous right to be more just, the continued struggle, to be more just, to be a more repaired society. And I think that the danger here in the way that the conversation about Black Lives Matter as an issue, not, I'm using that term as an issue, gets played out sometimes, is that the driving forces in that conversation are a far left that wants to dismantle the American liberal idea. And I'm not saying this about anybody in the Jewish community in particular, but far right forces who don't want to seek a more just America and don't want to do the work of repairing and improving America. Caught in between is all the nuance. And caught in between are all the people who care about the American idea.
So I'm going to try to summarize a few questions that are directly linked, which is just to say that it's not just a discomfort with the anti-Zionism within parts of the larger movement, but a deep feeling that there's an existential threat that causes us to remove ourselves from any use of the terminology Black Lives Matter, which brings about the fear that when you see Black Lives Matter on NBA courts and corporations, but not by the Jewish community, we've abandoned the just cause. How do we as a broader Jewish community take the lead and express our alliance despite this anxiety that we all feel, knowing the fragility of the Jewish state?
So I would say that there are multiple existential threats to the Jewish people. And I think we have to add that into this conversation, because I would say the denigration and destruction of the American democratic norms poses an existential threat to the Jewish people. The rise, the enablement of white supremacy in this country is an existential threat. Very frankly, the loss of American credibility as a global power and as a global leader is an existential threat to the state of Israel, which is not to say that the current president is anti-Israel. I'm just saying that the loss of credibility and the loss of ability to lead allies is also an existential threat. There are many existential threats. One of them is the rise of what is currently still a fringe left perspective on what the future of America is. That is an existential threat. I would say from a strategic level, our work as a Jewish community is about ensuring that that remains a fringe voice. From a values point of view, I think it's about fighting for what we believe in and what we value about this country. And both of those require us to figure out how to keep showing up with anybody who isn't that fringe left. And that if I see an NBA player with a Black Lives Matter hashtag on their uniform someplace, I want to start from the first place of assuming good intent. I want to start from the first place of assuming and understanding and hearing their experience as an African American. Many of these players have their own stories of actually experiencing that Black lives don't matter in their interactions with police, and they are happy to tell you. But I also want to be in a position, frankly, whether it's me personally or other people, that if they express an anti-Semitic thought or an idea, that somebody can have a conversation with them and unpack that. I think sometimes we can be a little too quick to say, you're anti-Semitic, we're done with you, you're verboten for life, as opposed to, you said something that is anti-Semitic, allow me to be in a relationship with you that tells you how I understand that to be anti-Semitic, and see if you want to grow from there.
Thank you. It is 7:59. On behalf of all of us, I want to thank, and on behalf of the Racial Justice Initiative, I want to thank Jeremy for being with us for a deeply philosophical and yet incredibly practical conversation, which was extremely helpful, I think, to all of us. I also want to invite everyone here to continue to get involved in the work of the Racial Justice Initiative and the JCRC. Jeremy, I want to give you a chance for a final word before we leave our Zoom room.
I would just, first of all, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for allowing me to be part of your community's conversation. My work, as I mentioned at the top, is very much about the network of institutions that are the organized Jewish community. It matters very dearly to me how our institutions that are the backbone of the community think about this work and do this work, and you are very much one of those institutions. So I'm happy to be part of this. I'm happy to come back. I'm happy to continue to learn with you. As I said, there's a lot of learning that will need to be done after this. I'm throwing a lot of stuff out there at a very, in some ways, high level. My goal here is, frankly, to offer complexity, but also frame it with something about morality, and to think about our morals, which should guide us to some clarity about what our morals are, whatever they may be, but also deep complexity. And I'll just leave with the thought that my number one, I have many existential threats I live with every night and lie awake about. My number one concern, not an existential threat, is our lack of ability to hold complexity in our public discourse, in the public debates, and in grappling with the most challenging issues of our time. It's that complexity which has to sit at the heart of this issue. And I encourage you to really hold that as you move forward.
Amen. Thank you so much. If you are not on the Racial Justice Initiative mailing list, I encourage you to do so. Many incredible things are taking place. Have a great night, everyone. Shabbat Shalom. Jeremy, Shabbat Shalom. Toda. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night. Laila Tov.